Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? I'm very glad. So you mentioned that I am a classical philosopher, which is a condensed truth, because this was my first education was to be a philosopher, and then I studied literature and philology. I am one of the last representatives of this species, I would say. We can see classical philologues there, so we are overrepresented, definitely, in this room. Thank you very much to Artur Górecki and all the organizers for inviting me to speak in this beautiful room. And I would also like to congratulate you for your courage, because asking a classical philologue to speak is very risky. First of all, classical philologue thinks that nobody is interested in what he's doing, because whatever he says, nobody will listen. And as an endangered species, he has the impression that he can say whatever he would like, because he has nothing to lose. But out of respect to you and to this room, I will try to behave decently, and I will try to answer the question, qui bono, for whose good, for whose benefit should we teach this dead language to young people today? And the answer is simple and short: for the benefit of all of us. And this thesis seems so obvious and simple to me that I am almost ashamed that I will be taking your time, but I will do it. When Saint Augustine, at the end of the 4th century, was in Milan at the imperial court, because he was promoted to the position which was created for Quintilian, which was the professor of rhetorics, one of the first of the rhetorics professors in the Imperium. He left behind the chair of rhetoric in Carthage, and he left behind Elogius, who you might not remember, but he also became the teacher of rhetorics himself. And now he asked his students to read a fragment of the textbook on invention, but then he realized that he did not understand everything from this fragment. Sometimes teachers and young lecturers can confirm from their experience. He simply could not get into this text. It's end of the 4th century. The text is really old. It's as if you were reading Shakespeare now. He did not understand everything in that time, because the text was 400 years old, but he had to present it to his students the following days. So what does Elogius does? He can't sleep. He's stressed, but finally he falls asleep, and in his dream, his former teacher, St. Augustine, comes to him and explains him this fragment. So you might be surprised that the text of Cicero was not understood, that somebody had to comment it, but that's how it was. 4th century is a moment where a lot of comments are created for Terentius, for Virgil. These are first broad comments. You would ask how those people spoke Latin. How should they not understand? But in fact, this was different from classical Latin. It changed, and then those people needed a comment. It means that they were sitting with this De Inventione of Cicero, the same way we sit together with the students and read the text and analyze the text together. This text is essential for many reasons. It's mainly called Rhetorica Prima in the Middle Ages because this is the basic textbook. Another is Rhetorica Athenaeum, which is also ascribed to Cicero. This is one of the first works which were printed later when the print was invented. But it's also essential for us because St. Augustine contributed to it being preserved and to preserve the art of oratory, because Christianity was not only becoming the leading religion, but also the only legal religion apart from Judaism. And many neophytes wanted to erase all the traces of previous civilizations. Saint Augustine was wise enough to preserve the grain of this classical culture, rhetorics, philosophy, and music. It's Saint Augustine who wanted to read all books for all the artes liberales, but he only wrote the musica and he started a few others, but the musica was preserved. And thanks to Augustine, we have this heritage now. What is essential, however, is that those works which were written in classical Latin already in 4th century required a comment. We have numerous documents, speeches regarding the education program in 17th, 18th century Krakow schools, the basic point of Renaissance education, what we can see in the views of professor from the college in Nowy Dwór, Mr. Piotrowski, was that the education was to educate the best citizens and Christians. Although with time the religious aspect moved to the background. In the Palace speech of Jan Marcinkowski, we will read that science helps us to control emotions, to learn virtues, and master the forms of thinking. What was obvious was that in order to achieve those effects of education will be to immerse in this classical literature and the classical languages of it, meaning Greek and Latin, in the grammar, poetry, philosophy. Similar speeches were made by brothers Sabiests. So we know that the father, Jacob, of the king, was sending their sons to learn Latin. And that's what he writes in the instruction to Mr. Orchowski. They will be learning Latin in schools, but for that you need also Latin conversation, because it's the conversation that will teach you that languages. Dinner and other times when there are no guests, they will speak with Mr. Rozenkiewicz and with his apprentice, Mr. Wyczka, who has already spent several years studying rhetoric at the Jesuits in Sandomierz. Barbara Strycharczyk writes as follows. Reading innate, the young Sabiest learned not only about the fate of the Roman national hero told as in the adventure novel, but also about the principles that guided this Trojan, recognized by the Romans as their ancestor. Virgil's portrayal of Aeneas' principles of conduct constituted the Roman civic code that shaped generations of brave Romans and enabled them to conquer the world. Jakub Sobieski wanted to prepare his sons, as he wrote himself, not for a detached or quiet life, but for public life or military and camp toil, a hero of unwavering courage, tough, just understanding, and above all with a sense of duty to his homeland, even stronger than love. This is what I added. Was a great example to follow by a young person who was preparing for the career of the first citizen in the state. This reading was also known to his father, Jakub Sobieski, but also to his grandfather, Stanisław Żółkiewski, on whose tomb the words from the innate spoken by Dido were engraved. May some avenger rise from my bones, and just as Dido, the Carthaginian queen, was to be avenged by Hannibal, so too Żółkiewski's avenger was to be John Sobieski III. John Adams, one of the founding fathers of the United States of America, at the age of 75, summing up his adult life, which he entered at Harvard as a lover of science, states that the necessity for me was to confine myself to limit myself only to Cicero in the John Adams was reading mainly classics, Greek and Latin, mainly Cicero, who as homo novus, as Adams, became a model of a citizen fighting for the common good. Years later, Adams remarks that reading the biography of Cicero, he notices that when he was reading the story of life of Cicero, it's as if he was reading the story of his life. All the events, the anecdotes, if you change the names, will be about his current times. This righteous man who did not have any slaves, first president and second vice president of the USA, he gained all his knowledge thanks to the contact with Latin and classical literature. What he writes at the end of 80s in his letters to his studying son is, in the company with Sallust, Cicero, Tacitus, and Livy, you will learn wisdom and virtue. You will see them represented with all the charm that only language and imagination can give you. Keep your Greek and Latin as a pupil in your eye. Adams, thanks to this, created the first constitution of the Massachusetts state, which then inspired the creation of the Constitution of the USA. Romantics, in so many respects different from their Enlightenment counterparts, were similar to them in one respect. They believed that Latin and Greek should be studied and that the ancient world should be learned. Without the antique key, you cannot create the door to the works of Goethe, whose ambition when he was a young man was to become a professor of Latin. When in 1808 in Erfurt, Napoleon asks if Goethe could not devote himself to writing a work on contemporary events, Goethe replies in French that these would rather require the pen of some ancient writer. Goethe had already been taught Latin by his father. Simply by speaking to him, he learned Greek from childhood until his late teens, and he translated from both languages. As Goethe was the fruit of homeschooling, his youthful translations from Latin are not particularly scholarly or accurate, although he knew many passages by heart from Ovid's Metamorphoses. He probably had good teachers who understood that the young poet was bursting with invention and creative energy, and perhaps this is why Latin opened his door to freedom. There was not a year in Goethe's life when he would not be reading all those classical works in the original, and there he found inspiration for his works. I will skip the story of Johann Theodor van der Kamp, who was a Protestant missionary fighting for the rights, for the abolition of slavery. In Africa, in southern Africa, but I will mention another a person, young Karl Marx, who was reading Latin for 8 years, 8 hours a week, and because he was an able and intelligent young man, his matriculation essay written in neat Latin was of course praised by the professors in Latin for tractatio argumenti, so the soundness of the argumentation, historical knowledge, especially for his attention to beautiful Latin. They were horrified only by the atrocious character of the writing. His PhD dissertation was about differences between natural philosophy and Democritus and Epicurus. When preparing for this, he wrote 7 notebooks which were maintained till today, and they show his knowledge about classical literature. One of the persons who was examining his work, Charles Babur, says that his works were full of Latin culture. He understood it as political, theological, and intellectual culture that was organized around the Latin. This was the culture embodied in Latin, a community of practices and institutions, not only language spoken. It did not belong to one state, a country. It spread across centuries and across lands. Marx defended his doctoral thesis at the University of Vienna, but he began writing it thinking of defending it in Berlin, where doctorates were then defended in Latin. His studies of pre-Socratics and Aristotle are reflected not only in his notebooks, but also in the concept of materialism, which closed his path for university career, but opened a new chapter in the political thought. In Wacowice, the teacher of Greek and Latin was menacing Zygmunt Damasiewicz. A good anecdote illustrating perhaps the later changes in Polish educational system was one of such the popular Damazy. did not appreciate the abilities of his pupil Gwiszcz. He would say that he would never pass his exam in Latin, but Gwiszcz not only passed his exam in Latin, but also became the headmaster of the school where Damasiewicz works. And then Damasiewicz took a year's leave. Damasiewicz, as I said, was a very tough teacher, but for the future Pope, he was a dream teacher. According to the recollection of his schoolmate, Eugeniusz Mróz, Wojtyła has always been prepared for class, and the hurricane of questions from Damazy often ended with him because he was the only one to know the answers. Mróz says that in the final years of middle school, Wojtyła's world was primarily German, Latin, and Greek poetry written in the original. He mentions Horace, Ovid, Virgil, the Iliad, and Odyssey, and Norwid. This is what he was passionate about. It is not surprising that his matriculation exam after 8th-class classical gymnasium was finished with very good grades in Greek and Latin, which maybe helped him to become the head of the church in the future. Is it conceivable that any of today's parents would send their child to a humanities class with extended Latin, dreaming of the young person becoming a scientist, an outstanding physicist or mathematician? It seems impossible. In 2018, the highest prize in mathematics went to an Italian, Alessio Figali, who spent his youth in Liceo Classico, meaning that type of Italian school, high school, where for the first 5 years you have 5 hours of Latin per day, and then for Greek for 4 hours, and then for 3 hours for the next 2 years. He was very good in it, and he's very proud to have graduated from this school. There was another physicist, Enrico Fermi, also graduated from the same school. As he was walking along the Campo di Fiori, he found the book, which is a compendium of physics, and that's why he became a physicist. Elementarium Physicae Mathematicae, written in 1840, was that book. Also, Stefan Bana, distinguished Polish mathematician, also graduated from classical gymnasium. Not only did this not prevent him from pursuing a career as a mathematician, but Bana admitted that he was weak in mathematics, having learned strict thinking from his Latin lessons. Without the achievements of these classically trained physicists and mathematicians, it is difficult to imagine the development of scientific technological civilization. Madeline Miller, she was also familiar with the works of Homer. Those works interested me in childhood, she writes, when my mom was reading me fragments of those books. So when she was putting me to bed, I still remember when my mom was reading those fragments. I was taken by this, and it hasn't changed. Homer's world is vast, exciting, tragic, intimate, full of wonder and mystery. Then she went to school with Latin, graduated in classical philology at Brown University, became a teacher of Latin, Greek, and an award-winning writer. And as a result, she wrote a hugely popular young adult novel about the Achilles and Patroclus, and fantastic feminist novel of ancient goddess Kirke, in which a female sorceress is at the center of events. In this way, Miller refreshes the classical tradition, making it accessible and interesting for young people who are not necessarily in love with the classical tradition, showing the contemporary aspect of the old Greek stories without exuding the pathos. Characteristic of, for example, Zbigniew Herbert and T.S. Eliot, for whom antiquity was not only more interesting than modernity, but also morally more perfect, which discourages often the young people, and which, as Petrarch has already argued, is not necessarily true. The Cicero of the letters is an ordinary man full of human weaknesses, quite different from the Cicero known from his own speeches or philosophical writings. J.K. Rowling, the writer we all know, was asked some time ago to give the commencement speech for the academic year at Harvard University, something that would probably not be possible today. There she shares her own experience, a provincial person from a not very wealthy and poorly educated family. Her parents' ambitions and the horizon of their dreams were quite mundane, down to earth. What she says herself: "My parents hoped I would become an engineer, and I wanted to study English literature." As a result of a compromise that satisfied no one, I went for modern philology. My parents' car had not yet disappeared outside the window when I quit German studies and rushed down the corridor towards classical philology. Rowling talks about how her parents wanted their child, the first of the family, to go to university to study something practical to provide her decent income. They certainly did not think it would be Greek mythology, and yet it was. The fact that Rowling encountered classical culture, Latin and Greek, at university is directly linked to the creation of the Harry Potter series. Harry Potter is a book that evokes controversies, but we need to say clearly that thanks to this book, millions of children in the world learned how to read, including my children. Me, as an expert from Christian literature, do not think that there is anything indecent in this literature. I will not mention the fact that Rowling's encounter with classical culture proved far more profitable for her, for the British Treasury, Hollywood, large group of actors, publishers, translators, or even booksellers, in a word, for thousands of people than if she had gone on to study even computer science or medicine. More important, it seems to me, is that Rowling remarks in her speech that one of the many things that she learned at the end of that classical philology corridor that she started when she was 18 in search of something she could not define was written by the Greek author Plutarch. What we achieve inwardly will change our reality. Up till now, somebody might tell that I did not say about enough of classical philology. But this topic is short. There is practically no Latin in Polish schools. Plus, it would cost me too many negative emotions. I will not convince any of you to learn Latin when I keep complaining about previous ministers and other persons responsible for the curriculum who let very good teachers leave and at their place hired new teachers. But this is the truth. Every retirement of a Latin teacher is an occasion for the pedagogical council to erase Latin classes. And there will be less and less of it because, as I said, there is practically no Latin in Poland at the moment. Thirdly, I've been trying to answer this question, cui bono, for whose benefit, because I think this is a basic question, especially today. And today, when I was talking about the meeting of all the above-mentioned persons with Latin and Greek, I was talking about hundreds of hours spent in schools and universities mastering antique language, which would allow to read classical books independently. In Poland, it's not possible. In Bavaria, a student has a limited number of learning. In Belgium, in France, it will be even less. But in Poland, currently in the system, the maximum is 240 hours. But this is about 20-something classes in the whole class year, throughout the whole Poland. So we need to say openly that there is no good reason to close the doors of young people to meet the classical culture at the same rights that people have been doing for centuries for their own benefit. I do not see the reason why this number is so small. When we look at the year 1992, for example, as 0.0, we see that every 10 years, the number of students learning Latin in Poland falls 4 times. This is a waterfall which is cannot be explained in any way by a comparison with Western Europe, where we were kind of allowed in 2004. I would like to ask you a question. What would have happened if J.K. Rowling did not go to classical philology and she went to marketing instead? If Karol Wojtyła would have become a pope if he hadn't studied Latin? If Stefan Banach would have become a genius mathematician? Enrico Fermi a physicist? What would American democracy be if the founding fathers had not been reading Cicero in original, and so on and so forth? Latin is not impractical. For ages, lessons of Latin were for the benefit of us in many ways. Latin, classical Latin, have always been a certain set of exercises, a form and content that brought and are still bringing benefits to world culture. The Latin lessons and meeting with classical culture inspired great people to create new forms of political life and new works. What is important is those persons were completely different. They lived different times. Their meetings with Latin and Greek, however, changed their lives forever. Karl Marx, Stefan Banach, all the other protagonists of my story, they all learned on Cicero and other great persons. When they were thinking or writing in the language which is dead now, they were absorbing this antique world to understand their world better. Antiquity is so universal that it inspired everyone. And it's not surprising because teaching Latin in school is not ideological or worldview issue. It's rather a common sense created in Greco-Roman antiquity. Grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, tragic and lyrical poetry were and are practical school for the intellectual and spiritual development of not only humanists and light-hearted people. Cutting Polish students off from possible inspirations that have worked for centuries is certainly harmful. I am glad that you at the ministry have noticed this bad trend and are trying to reverse it. May the public opinion be mature enough to understand that increasing the number of people learning Latin in Poland is not a return to Middle Ages or an ideological project of conservatists, but a sensible action that can contribute to the common good. Because that's how it has been for centuries, a thorough study in the original of the outstanding masterpieces of ancient literature, and not only what I've been trying to show is not only useful, but, and I've already run out of time for this, is a fantastic spiritual and intellectual adventure, which I wish for as many young people as possible living in our feuding republic.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much. And the hosts of this meeting asked me to say 2 words about the Olympiad of Latin language. I am the right person to talk about the Olympiad of Latin language for 2 reasons. One, less important, is that I am the president of the main committee, and I am also as old as the Olympiad of the Latin language. This Olympiad is quite advanced in age, is a great enterprise because it's organized by great people who have the motivation and who are doing great job. These are the secretaries of district secretaries. These are the persons who create tests and questions, and these are mainly teachers who very often, at the cost of their own time and family time, prepare students for reading a text which was created and written a long time ago by a person who really lived authentically, like Julius Caesar, and so that they have the possibility of getting an insight into the thinking of those persons without any intermediary. This is the greatest benefit of this Olympiad. So there is a direct message. So they are really a kind of reading those. Okay, they can read those texts in original, and the Olympiad of Latin language, as I said, has been organized for over 40 years. But the number of students is decreasing proportionally to the decreasing number of students who are learning Latin in Poland. It's very difficult to convince young persons who do not really learn Latin in school to participate. But there is a miracle happening because some young people actually convince each other. We have more and more examples when the winners of the Olympiad become persons who never learned Latin at schools. I'm not saying that being proud of the situations. On the contrary, I think this is a reason to be sad that our school is not able to provide our students what they have to look for on their own. So I would like you to contribute to the development of the Latin language. I'm talking to the superintendents of schools, to you as teachers, but also parents, to think again, is it worth to get rid of this Latin? Because this is the risk that we are facing, that Latin language is going to completely disappear.